really what is one of the more complex diseases to treat. And one of the reasons that it makes it more complex than a lot of other things is ultimately it lives in so many aspects of life. So, right, if it just lived in the medical field, then it would live in the medical field. Great, we would just treat it like heart disease. You know, we give you some medicine, lower your blood pressure, tell you you should eat better, lose some weight, and then we'll see you again in 3 months. And then if you had a heart attack, we give you a heart cath, we give you some medication, we tell you, great, we're going to see you again in 3 months. But unlike that, this one has a tendency, just based on the behaviors that, like we talked about, are very predictable. It has a predilection to get you into crossways with the rest of society, and that may mean, in this case, law enforcement. And so I want to focus a little bit on the role of addiction in law enforcement, and that is not only the treatment of addiction kind of within a law enforcement setting, but really the role that law enforcement has had to play. It's probably not their space to play, meaning we force them kind of to be social workers, and that's confusing if you've never worked in a law enforcement capacity. And so before I started full-time in emergency medicine, I had actually worked as a tactical operator for the Federal Protective Service in DC. And so I got trained and was a part of a tactical unit and would get deployed both on what we call CONUS and OCONUS missions, so continental U.S. and out-continental U.S. missions, specifically for medical tactical support. So I was like a twofer, meaning I would show up and I could do doctor stuff, but then I also carried a weapon and handled my self-protection plus force protection. And so I then was one of the medical operators for the Philadelphia SWAT team, and where I had trained, and then was the medical director for Grand Rapids Police Department and their SWAT team for, or SRT specifically for them for, I guess about 7 years. Until we had kids, they got old enough to where my wife said anything that requires Kevlar, I think we're not going to allow in our house anymore. So all my fun went away. So I've worked in that space. I work with the DEA currently on evaluating providers. And germane to this conversation, I think, is we currently have pretty large-scale grants that I'm the subject matter expert on, and one that I'm the PI on, the primary investigator, where we're implementing medication-assisted treatment and addiction screening and treatment throughout the entire CDCR community, meaning the entire prison system in the state of California. We've developed a strategic plan. We're writing SOPs, and then we're setting up training for their entire medical staff at every single prison. And then, as you guys know, there is a jail collaborative that's happening that we're working on, that I'm one of the subject matter experts, and that's run by Donna Strugard-Fritsch, who's a nurse who's been doing this for years and knows this stuff backwards and forwards. So, in New Jersey, where I lived before I moved back to Michigan, Ann Arbor, there's a program that we had kind of started. It was mainly spearheaded by the sheriff in Gloucester County that focused on, he was the head of the statewide Sheriff's Association in that capacity, and then also in his own practice was one of the first ones that allowed for Narcan to be administered. And his police units, everybody got trained, and they started delivering it because it was a big deal. South New Jersey, for those of you that don't know it, maybe you've heard of Camden, New Jersey. It's usually in the top 5 most violent places in the country, top 5 poorest communities in the country, and that's where I've done street medicine for 2 years. And Gloucester County is just right south of that, so it abuts it. And what was interesting is once they put this out there was the usual resistance to anything new. You're adding to my scope of practice, this is confusing. What do you want me to do? We have EMS, we have fire. My role is to make sure that we have secured the environment, that we have halted the threat, and that we maintain safety for the providers that are showing up, and that is my job. And that is the primary job. But then they gave them Narcan, and then they started to use it, and now every year they give out an award for the most saves to the officer who has the most saves. And it's been an interesting change over the last couple of years since they started that, because where it used to be when the call would come in for a probable overdose, you know, the patrol would slow walk to the scene because it's not something that generally requires a secure, there's no like action, it's more just paperwork. It's like who gets to do this paperwork for the scene call. And then what happened is they found that they ended up with multiple officers on scene because they were fighting for who was going to revive this person, because we had a higher density of police officers as compared to EMS and fire, who could get there more quickly. And so they were basically figuring out who could save the most people, and it was a competition. And I've never seen in the local capacity a complete shift of how the community saw the police. Because it went from an adversarial relationship to, you just saved my kid, and then you just saved my brother, and then my neighbor's kid, and then this. And it completely changed the dynamic of interaction to really living up to that kind of to serve and protect feeling. And it really empowered the police officers to feel like they could do more than just be perceived as the heavy hand. And so now they embrace it and they enjoy it, and they really, it's kind of a fun thing for them, and they look forward to that. And they've now moved that award to the kind of the police officer ball thing that they have every year, and that's one of their big awards that they give. So it's interesting because we're still, I think, struggling in law enforcement to identify what the role really is. What is the role of jails? What is the role of prisons? What is the role of community policing? What is the role of probation, parole, AB 109? Whatever aspect of this is. Because in the past, the whole point of this was you committed a crime, you were convicted and sentenced, you served your time, and we feel that you're safe enough to be out, but we need to keep an eye on you so you get on parole or probation. And through that, if you live up to the letter of the law, then you have served your time, and you have we deem you to be safe for community living. The problem is that if somebody ended up with 1 or 2 or 3 felonies because they got a bit on top of a B&E or resisting or whatever, then now we have somebody with multiple felonies who can't get a job, can't get housing, and still never did really get good treatment for addiction. And that really prevented them from ever really evolving into the human that they wanted, because we were not only not treating the disease that was a pretty serious illness and a high risk, but they didn't feel like they had the capacity to ever reintegrate into society because they had this scarlet letter of felony that they could never get out from behind. So I think now we're starting to ease into what is the role of law enforcement, and the role of law enforcement is still very specifically to serve and protect and to identify how they maintain the safety of the general public. Now, if you're driving recklessly and you have an alcohol use disorder and you're driving a car under the influence, that's really unsafe. You're driving a weapon. That requires not only aggressive treatment, but punishment, because that is something that put a lot of other people at risk. It kills families, it kills other human beings, and so we have to recognize that even though someone may have committed a crime because they were under the influence of a substance and have a substance use disorder, there is still a role for law enforcement to be involved and for punishment to actually be a part of the pathway. So we can't completely remove it. But at the same time, what we have is a rare opportunity to take an individual who is now in a confined environment, so they can't decide whether or not they really want to show up that day. They're kind of there. And then we can add evidence-based treatment to help stabilize them, because jail, unfortunately, is also not safe if you're prone for overdose or use, because drugs make their way into jail. And people say, well, if we just cut that down. I will tell you, I've worked in and around law enforcement and jails and prisons for a long time. It is amazing how drugs get into jails or prisons. And the organizations behind the stocking of drugs, the selling of drugs, and the movement of money outside of those drugs that are sold internally it's actually pretty amazing the levels that it goes to. So people will, I'll give you an example. So there was one place where one of the gangs internally had broken an area of curb over time. So they slowly would chip at it till it broke away and broke away and broke away and broke away. They then identified the contracting company that was going to come in and fix it, because they knew who the general contractor was that did the work and maintenance around there. They identified the people that were going to do the concrete. They both forced and paid them to come in, and when they laid the new curb, they laid about 6 kilos of cocaine inside the curb when they fixed the curb. And so the gang members knew that it was there, and so they went out and slowly broke down the curb, that was there, took out the cocaine, and the curve got fixed again. And then this time it was heroin inside it. So this happened until they just finally randomly identified it when somebody happened to go over and step, and then it cracked all the way off and then it fell out. So, I mean, that's sophisticated. That's a lot of preparation and work. So it's not always as simple to decrease that, but what we can do is decrease the need to use that drug. Meaning the same way we would do that in the outside space, meaning we can give somebody a medication to stabilize dopamine. When we stabilize dopamine, we decrease craving, we stabilize kind of the emotional, contextual need for that drug. And when that happens, they're less likely to seek it out. So that's one side of the equation. One of the other problems that we identify, though, because you always have to look for unintended consequences, is maybe they were buying drugs from someone who was protecting them because they were buying drugs from them, and now all of a sudden they're no longer buying drugs from them. So what does that mean for their safety inside? And we had people who were on naltrexone, so Vivitrol, one of the blocks opioids, and they had been given an injection, and so they couldn't get high. They were still buying heroin because they didn't want to get beaten up. I mean, so it's not just, hey, we can put treatment in a jail and all of a sudden magic happens. Or we give, Narcan to every police officer and all of a sudden everybody's safe. It really has to be a full effort, no different than building a treatment system in a hospital, building a treatment system in a county, and looking at it. We really have to start looking at both the intended and unintended consequences. Who's going to staff it? Who has ownership? How do we make sure that these screenings get done? If somebody's in jail and they're only there for 8 hours because they get arraigned and they leave, and we don't even know that's going to happen, how do we screen them? Did we screen them? Who's responsible? When does that occur? Does it occur in the court? Does it occur when you fingerprint them? Where does all of this stuff happen? So the entire kind of value stream of pathway of treatment has to be built. Because a jail, and anyone who says, well, we just need to put medication-assisted treatment into the people who are incarcerated, have never been inside of a jail or prison. Because a jail and a prison are very different worlds. They're completely different, both from a value stream mapping, like lean processing standpoint of the business of how do we set this up. And they're also different from a cultural standpoint, an ownership standpoint, a staffing standpoint from the medical side. The capability to do a dosing line in the morning when almost everybody in a jail ends up in court at some point throughout a day and you're having to move people around. And how do you get people dosed for their medication without it taking too long? And how do you, if you're going to dose a person for medication, make sure it doesn't get diverted? After they do it, who's checking it? Is it custody or is it medical? Because those are supposed to be different, but sometimes jails are the ones who pay for the nurses, and then the doctors are separate and they live on medical. And so when there's that overlap, who plays what role? It's just complex. It's a really complex problem to try to evaluate. So it's not just a matter of, let's just put medication-assisted treatment in the jails. Okay. Let's put a man on the moon. It's equally as complicated. Because we have physics, we have engineering, and we have math that will get somebody to the moon. In fact, we did that, as we all know, 50 years ago. But yet we haven't gone back. And so it's complex enough that it takes a while for these things to happen. But this one has a lot of moving parts. It has laws that are different in every county. It has magistrates that have a different viewpoint. It has prosecutors that have a different viewpoint. It has defense attorneys. It has treatment personnel and custody professionals and sheriffs that change. And so as these things change, what's in the purview of the sheriff versus what's in the purview of the medical staff? Should the sheriff make any decisions about medical? Should the medical just have free reign? Where does this is all an issue that goes along with when we talk about law enforcement and what is the role of this, what is their role in this place? And so it is not easy. And if they have to deal with their own budget cuts, their own staffing issues, it's not like they have a cadre of social workers that can see every patient that comes into a jail. They don't have staff there 24/7 most of the time. It's typically a day program, and they can call, and if somebody gets sick, they just send them to the emergency department. And I can tell you as an ER doctor, when they show up, we try to quickly get them out so that the staff doesn't have to sit there all night. And when we would see them, we do a quick medical clearance, maybe give them some meds if it's alcohol withdrawal or something, and send them right back. It's not really treatment, Band-Aid. You don't want to put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. That doesn't really help. They cover the outside hole a little bit, make you feel better, but it doesn't do a whole lot for what's going on the inside. So I think as we start to talk about what is the role of medication-assisted treatment in law enforcement, it's a bigger topic than you would think at the beginning. It's got a lot of idiosyncrasies that we have to think about and be aware of. And that doesn't even account to what is the role of trauma-informed policing. I mean, how do we implement that? I mean, I have a weapon and they may have a weapon, and how do I de-escalate a situation so that I can even identify that trauma-informed anything is there? When I was trained as an operator, it is force. It is force for your protection. It's not necessarily force for force's sake. Your voice is the first weapon you have as a police officer, which is why it's always loud. You know, when you bang down a door or you get someone and it immediately escalates, your immediate rapid de-escalation technique is for you to escalate past where they are. I mean, that's the teaching. The teaching is not like we learn in healthcare where if somebody's escalating, we learn, you know, rapid de-escalation techniques and we can talk, hey, you know, we're just all here chilling out. But you don't know. You can usually see this person. They've gone through triage and they can hang out. But if they're sitting in a car or they're in a house and you can't see it, this is just a different environment. So I think just trying to understand the frame that happens in those situations can be helpful. But also what I find is switching the frame from the law enforcement side of this person deserves what they got. They've committed this crime, they've gone in, and they deserve this, and why should I give them anything else? I mean, they're the ones, and we'll hear this from people who didn't commit a crime. Why should this person get a leg up? I didn't commit a crime, why should I have to compete with them for the same job I have? I don't care if they have a felony. I mean, honestly, we hear these things on all sides. So, if we start to look at the data, which is where I always like to go back to, right? So the data science and math of this is that the data for use of medication-assisted treatment in jails and prisons is thin, but good. Meaning, in Rhode Island, when they started to do these treatments, when they started to treat patients in jails and prisons, it significantly decreased the recidivism rate, the mortality rate, and increased the entrance into treatment rate. Now they have data that's about to come out. I've been working with them with Brandeis on collecting these data and getting them calculated and out. And the data that they're looking at now is it actually got about 400% more back to work by just starting treatment while they were there. So let's talk through why some of these things may happen. And in order to think about this, we also have to think about who is at highest risk for death in any community from opioid overdose. We know that who's at without question, the highest risk of overdose. Yeah, someone who was recently incarcerated and released. They are 60 times, not 60%, 60 times more likely to overdose in the 30 days after release than any other actively addicted person who's using injectable drugs. What is the average time between release and use? Less than 3 hours. The vast majority of the time, it's right outside of the parking lot. And it actually comes from a positive place sometimes, from their friends picking them up. It's like, hey man, congratulations, you're out. We gotta, let's party, let's celebrate. Oh, and you overdosed and died. I mean, and that's how it happens because tolerance goes away, even if you're just there for a few days. Tolerance decreases and depletes. You go through withdrawal, everything starts to kind of reset, you go out, somebody gives you something, it doesn't even have to have fentanyl in it or one of the synthetics, and you still have an overdose. Or, you're just back off to the races. It's right back where you were. You had a chance, you felt good, you felt like you could do this, and then you got out, and bam, all it took was that one switch to get flipped, and then you feel right back where you were. And then you have the guilt and the shame, and then you know you're going to have to follow up with your probation officer, and then you miss the first one. Because you know when they urine test you, it's going to be positive for things it's not supposed to be positive. So you skip it and you make up an excuse. And then that happens 1 or 2 times. But they don't recognize that every probation officer, after about 2 weeks, knows all of these excuses. And it's really hard to come up with a new one that they haven't heard, right? So there's just a reality of how we do this. So if we start to think about how do we build a system in a community that has your back if you have addiction no matter where you show up. That no matter where you are, we got your back. Even if you're not ready to get better. Even if you're not ready to step in and do full treatment. And part of that is, we can't even do it in hospitals on a consistent basis. So I want us to make sure that as a community, we level set and really do think about, we shouldn't hold somebody to a higher standard that we can't do in the one place that's supposed to be the safety net. You know, if we can't go all in healthcare in general, I think it's important that we push it out to places where we have a high risk group of people. But let's level set expectations to the point of this we're having to build this as we fly it. And as we fly it and we build it, we recognize that we have good data behind it, but then we also have to make sure that we recognize we need local data behind it as well. As we go, we should be tracking it, we should be thinking about it, we should be asking really tough questions and moving forward at a pace that allows us to iterate. Meaning if we pick a pathway and it's not great, let's move, let's rotate a little bit. So, in the perfect world of treatment, I think the data would show that if you start a patient on medication-assisted treatment inside of a jail or a prison, that means you've identified that they have an illness, that it's severe enough to require medication, and that you've appropriately started the evidence-based pathway for this. That means you've taken away withdrawal. That means you've stabilized their thought process and their dopamine. That means you've motivated them to probably be a little bit more involved in their arraignment, a little more involved in their trial, a little more involved in their defense, a little more likely to get a lighter sentence because they're thinking more clearly, more logically, a little more likely to actually want to do better, to say, I will go into a diversion program, I want to do this, I don't want to be here, rather than this despair and anger and frustration and just this thought process that they get stuck in. And then obviously in prison, we wonder, well, they're in prison, why do we need to have them on medication? Well, the answer is because we talked about how emotional memory needs to be onboarded. Well, for most people, they still need to stabilize dopamine. If you've had an addiction severe enough to put you in a situation in which it matches criminogenic behavior that gets you incarcerated in a prison, it's probably severe. It's probably had a pretty good impact on how you are at this moment and what it looks like. And so if that's the case, we should deliver the highest level of treatment, which quite honestly for opioid use disorder is MAT. All residential does is takes them out of a poor recovery environment, or manages withdrawal. It doesn't do much else because you still have to recover where you live. Because if you can't recover where you live, you can't recover. It's easy. I can get bright, shiny stars. You give me 200 people, I'll get 150, 175 of them looking beautiful at the end of 30 days in an inpatient space in Malibu. We'll pet some horses, we'll swim a little bit, we'll chit-chat about the sun. It'll be great. We'll sit around, we'll be introspective and relaxing, we'll have good places to sleep and food, exercise. Then they got to go back to a place where their neighbor sells drugs. And then they got to go back to a place where they're going to get the crap beat out of them by the guy they owe money to. So we have to really just be understanding that if we can get them well inside jail, that's a pretty high stress environment, actually. Inside a prison, a pretty high stress environment. And we can predict kind of where they're going to be tomorrow, where they're going to be the next day. Not always in jail, but mostly in prison you can predict that. But in jail, we can manage that uncertainty by where we start our intervention and how it works out. So, any questions about that? Does anybody here work? I know I have my folks from law enforcement in the back. Any part of that sounds like just pie in the sky BS to you guys, or anything you would want to add, for clarification for the community? Because I think it's important that they understand that it is a world unto itself, and that there are aspects of it that are mandated by statute that you have to follow, and then there are aspects of it that you can manipulate a little bit, but not a lot. You can't just make it up as you go. But anything you guys want to add?
I think as Sergeant Gladding said earlier, law enforcement is definitely a different beast because I come from construction, property management, fundraising, nonprofit work, and now probation for 4.5 years. And so you see that 99% of who you work with, give or take, it's addiction-based. But you're ordered by the court to have this client abstain from alcohol, not use drugs, not associate with a known drug user, which is their whole support, their whole social network, and then you're supposed to change their life completely. And if they don't, you utilize every resource, which up to this point is pretty limited in every county, small or big. And if they don't utilize the resources, then you put them in jail as a form of discipline. And worst case scenario, you time them out and they go to prison or long-term custodial time under 1170H.
Yep.
So we as a community have to find some way of supporting them and providing a new network of people that are in the pursuit of the same thing with those that are not living that life, that are not putting them under the stigma of addiction and criminal behavior because they do look alike, and over time they're pretty much the same thing. So as a probation officer, at this point in time, harm reduction right now across California, my understanding, sounds great, looks great, but we're still moving in a direction where we're trying to swallow it and what that looks like in law enforcement as a profession and in the court.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that, and I appreciate your honesty. So law enforcement, especially probation, gets squeezed a lot because you can flash incarcerate someone, but does that help or does it hurt? The answer would be sometimes it helps and sometimes it hurts. It depends, right? There's data that was done by law enforcement out of Missouri and Hawaii, and now it's been done in a number of other places where they found that if you have someone who looks unstable and worrisome for risk, a flash incarceration of 24 hours actually is helpful for stabilization and reconnection. But you don't want to put them in longer because if you do, any work that they had or family obligations they had usually get really wrecked. And so figuring out how you use flash incarceration for a positive impact rather than creating a bigger hurdle. The judges is a huge piece, so I spent a lot of time having to deal with judges, and the only people with big equal egos to doctors are judges. So, and I say that obviously being a doctor and my wife being a lawyer, but when we look at this, I mean, we butt heads a lot, but what I've come to recognize is that it's not my job to adjudicate. That's their job to adjudicate. It's also not their job to pick which methodology of treatment that they prefer. So when they dictate this person needs to be off of medication, that's out of their scope of practice, and quite honestly, it's practicing medicine without a license. And I sued a county judge in Michigan for practicing medicine without a license when he mandated that my pregnant patient had to get off MAT or he was going to pull her kids. So I filed suit federally because controlled substances are actually managed federally. And so you can actually sue a state or county judge through the federal means for practicing medicine without a license if it has to do with a controlled substance. And I had the ACLU, and it got really ugly at this point. He finally capitulated and just finally allowed it to happen and then stepped down after that. But at the end of the day, it's not my role to tell them how to sentence someone. I'm not an expert in sentencing guidelines. I'm not an expert in that. All I ask of judges is to mandate that a person engage in evidence-based treatment and follow through with all of the recommended treatment pathways identified through their evaluation. That's it. Because that's going to allow us to know that addiction treatment is not addiction treatment, right? We didn't talk about it that much this morning. We talked about the neuroscience of addiction. But if we really got into brass tacks of what is addiction, it's not just a medication in a clinic. I mean, there's this thing called the ACM criteria, which allows us to understand that you have every level of care from early intervention in 0.5 to outpatient, to opioid treatment programs, to intensive outpatient, which is level 2.1, and level 2.5 for partial hospitalization, 3.1 for residential. But if you don't really know this, and I say level 3.1, well, we got to put them in for 3.1. That's actually less than half the hours they're going to get in IOP of clinical intervention. So really, if they're sick, they need IOP outpatient and not a residential treatment. Residential treatment, at least at the 3.1 level, is really only for people who have most of their life put together but have an unstable recovery environment, and we're just trying to figure that out. And so it's not just I need to get them somewhere, because most of the rehabilitation, inpatient sides of rehabilitation places are only 3.1s. So it's actually the lowest level of care for addiction. In fact, an opioid treatment program has a higher level of care than does a level 3.1 as far as structured clinical intervention, because 3.1 only requires 5 hours a week. I don't expect the judge to know that. I don't expect them to know that level 3.3 is for cognitively impaired subsets of the population, including traumatic brain injury, and it's not their job. But it's my job, and it's a lot of your jobs. And so they need to defer to the field. So all I want, and we ask, and that's most of the conversation that I have with law enforcement, at least from the adjudication side, from prosecutors and defense attorneys and that, is look, I recognize that you don't necessarily get this whole addiction thing, and we're happy to teach you, but we have a system for this, and we've had it for years, and we know we've really gotten good at it at this point, how to pick it out, and we can work together on this. Because it puts you in a bind when you say that somebody has to be 100% abstinence, and I would tell you that not one of my patients is 100% abstinent. I mean, it's just a reality. I could confine them literally in isolation in Alcatraz, and maybe I could keep them from not having a little slip, or maybe using another substance, maybe not the one that they're in trouble for, but just something else. Maybe something that they know is not going to show up on a urine drug screen, like K2. Maybe kratom. Maybe they're going to do something even more dangerous like huffing, because they know it's not going to show up on a urine tox screen. And all they have to do is go to arrowhead.com and find out exactly what they can use that's not going to show up on your drug screen. So the reality is we have to just come at this from an addiction treatment standpoint. And the addiction treatment standpoint is for you to identify, here's what is adjudicated. It says you have to go to treatment and adhere to the treatment requirements. And if you follow that, then great. If it's unstable, and I've worked with I do all of our probation officers in Grand Rapids, and we work really closely with them. Because I would call them and say, hey, I need this person flash incarcerated. I need them in for a day. I'm scared for them, and I think they're going to do poorly. And then they would just they'd push a warrant, pick them up, and put them in for a day. My team would go and see them in the jail. We'd figure out what our next plan is, and then we would get them out, and we would go. We'd cover for them for work, like a doctor's note, like all those things that you do. You got their back. I want them to not die. I want them to be safe. But that only works if you work together. Like, we can't just expect, probation and parole and law enforcement to live on an island. I mean, they don't. They live in the community. They live here. I mean, they're members of this community. So figuring out how we connect in such a way that it's just, if a patient inside of an incarcerated environment has an addiction, which you said it feels like 99%, well, the interesting thing is it's by all the data, 90% of people that are currently incarcerated in prison have a substance use disorder, and 75% of people in jail meet for a hard substance use disorder. Almost 100%, and that's not including tobacco. If you add tobacco, it's 100%. But if I just use the drugs that really can cause short-term harm or are illegal, then we have a huge percentage. So it is the highest percentage population that's confined. In business, we talk about where is the point or the place that I can do the least amount of work for the best amount of outcome. Right? Where can I do a little bit of work and get a huge positive outcome? Well, this is in the jail or prison system, period. I mean, there's just no other place other than the LMD ward that you get like this biggest bang for your buck. And so if I identify a pregnant patient, love it. It's a twofer. Because if I get mom stable, then I get baby and mom out. They go home as a family, and they get home, and everybody's happy. If I get somebody in jail and I really sit down and we have a conversation about, what do they want to do? And why aren't they able to do that? And we can work through a plan. We have a safety plan. We start them on medication. We decrease their chances of overdose, because what we do is we discharge them at 3 o'clock in the afternoon rather than 2 o'clock in the morning, and they get a ride directly to treatment. And then they make sure that they follow up. And maybe we hold them for a couple of days if we don't have that. We don't have the authority to, but most will stay, to be honest. They identified this in Rhode Island. They offered them a couple of, an extra day so they could finish the coordination and connection. And most of them were like, that's fine. They're scared. They don't want to go out and do this. They know what's going to happen. And so the vast majority of people have met where they are in a trauma-informed way, meaning I recognize that life has not been good for you. I recognize that things have gone awry, and that this is not what you woke up with when you were 12 years old and said, this is where I want to be. So let's figure out how we undo that. And if you work with them to get there, then we decrease their recidivism by 60%. We decrease their overdose rate by 80% in the next 30 days if we have them on MAT. So these numbers are crazy, right? I mean, we don't have other interventions that do that stuff. And so the key is to figure out how, as a community, we can guarantee to the judges, to the prosecutors, to the defense attorneys, and the parole that what we're delivering for addiction care is good. That it is high quality and evidence-based. Because this has been the one big pushback that I've gotten from parole and probation and family court judges on Child Protective Services is, well, I'm worried that if we refer them somewhere for treatment, that I don't think they're using evidence-based treatment. I think they're using blank, 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 or this pathway, and they're not doing that. So that means we have to up our game. And we also need to be better at communicating, which means the patients need to sign 42 CFR Part 2 compliant forms that say, you're willing to let me communicate appropriately with your probation officer for your safety and betterment, because I want you off of probation. I want you in a job. I want you to have a pathway to felony abatement. I want you to be able to figure this out. And if we do this, this, and this, we can get that there and create that. And those are really important themes that we have to, as a community, do together. Those don't occur by one side saying, I need to put MAT in jails. It just doesn't work that way. I wish it was that easy. I wish it was like adding a new blood pressure medicine that we just gave people, but it's not. There's a lot of stuff that have to go around it. And in prison, I mean, another unintended consequence. So we're also identifying groups in the prison system. We're actually going to retool yards. A yard is one of the subsections where they have a community of people that are there, and many of them will have different yards that you go to. Sometimes they splice them by gang, sometimes they splice them by culture, race, sometimes they don't splice them and they just have general but in the end, we're actually creating yards within the prison system that are recovery yards. So ones that people that want to be in recovery and are either on MAT or off MAT, but still want to be in a place that's a recovery environment, then they can go there. And so they were really happy to hear this, but then one of the unintended consequences somebody said is like, look, I want to get better, but I'm one of the people that sells. You know, and if I stop selling, my family's in danger. Because me selling internally keeps my family safe while I'm inside. What do I do? I don't know. I don't know what you do. I mean, this is complex. This is really highly complex stuff, because now I'm asking somebody who really wants to get better, who wants to be on this recovery yard. They know they can't, because if they get caught selling, then you can't get on there. You're off there. And I mean, there's just a lot of stuff we have to work through here. I mean, there's a complex network of problems. Every time we pull up a lid, we find 50 other things under that we have to identify and fix. So it is a concerted, community-based effort that we have to work through historical connections, historical frustrations, and all of that, so that the people in the community see law enforcement as just another continuum of the treatment pathway for those that end up in that pathway. Obviously, the biggest piece is if we have a really good treatment on this side, we give them a lot less people to deal with down the road, right? So if we do a great job with treatment in the community, less people will resort to criminogenic behavior in order to obtain the means in order to buy the drugs, right? So we have to get there. What questions do you guys have about that? This has been a lot of talking all day. I'd like to just answer. Yeah.
It's actually not a question, but I just, since we're on the topic, I just want to thank probation for being here and for always showing up to our trainings, and most of our clients that are on probation just are constantly telling us how probation is their biggest advocate, they're the person pushing them forward, getting them sober, standing by their side. So I just really want to thank you guys for being here and participating, and always really putting our clients first and making sure that they have great treatment. And they're super great about being collaborative and talking with us, and I just think that that's so amazing. It's really special. I've worked in other areas and have never had such great probation officers who care so much about their clients. So I think it's really special.
No, that's great. That actually I've been in a lot of communities. I've been in, I guess, 42 counties now in the state of California. I've gotten to know enough about each of those, and through that, there are some that's not the case. There's some that's highly adversarial. It's very detrimental to the community itself, and I think that those are the things that I don't sense here. So I think you guys are ahead of the game in a lot of ways, but we have to take that next step of there are logistical realities of using controlled substances inside of a jail. There are logistical realities of doing appropriate screening, assessment, and level of care determination inside and outside of a jail. Who does it? Who owns it? How's it paid for? You know, whose budget does that come out of? And where does that live? And I mean, these are just all the reality. So screening and assessment can be done quickly. Level of care determination takes a little while. So figuring out how we offset that. How do we set up these basic tools so that it can be done quickly online and then transferred without having to be redone every time they go somewhere else? These are all technical things that can be solved. And I think the biggest piece that's the hardest one in any community is solving the adaptive problem. It's the hearts and minds problem most of the time. It's rarely the technical stuff that gets in the way. We're pretty smart. We got a lot of stuff we can do. There's enough business knowledge and business technology to value stream map all this stuff out. That's not a big deal. It is, however, getting custody officers on board. It is getting wardens on board. It's getting sheriffs on board. It's getting legacy police officers who've done this for a very long time and quite honestly have experienced so much secondary trauma through their career that they're burnt and they're crispy and they're frustrated. And just like we get, it's no different, right? I mean, when you go out and the stuff you see, I was a paramedic before I went to medical school, when I was going to college, and that's a whole different world, right? Because you're in people's house. You're there. And you're in wherever you are. You're in the middle of the street doing whatever. You're in there, whatever gross, nasty place that you get called to go to. And you just go. You go and you show up and you're in that environment. And even in that environment, most of the time we're protected from the grossest, nastiest stuff because that's usually quarantine and the police officers have to take care of that. And so the highest traumatic environment for people on a daily basis is not fire and EMS, it's actually police. And the amount of ongoing trauma that is seen within the police force over time that happens within their own communities is pretty crazy. And the general wellness pathway and interaction is tough, and which is why we see a higher degree of substance use disorder in that profession, because it is rough. I mean, the stuff that I saw in my very short stint doing DC work, and we only did big federal warrants. We didn't even do like the normal day-to-day. We weren't doing, doors on a regular basis for warrants all the time, and so it gets to be tough, and making sure that we have their back as well when somebody's crispy and frustrated. That if you have an officer who escalates their behavior, what to you may seem inappropriately, recognizing that we have to have their back, because we don't know what happened yesterday. We don't know if they had to arrest a dad who just beat their kid to death. I mean, these are just things that happen. I mean, and so this is a community response, and unless we actually take in the people who have to do the serving and protecting, have to identify the healthcare out in the community, go out and try to do prevention and harm reduction, because harm reduction is super simple, right? If you take A and you recognize that if you do B, it makes A less problematic. It's just a decision of where we feel comfortable where it goes. It has nothing to do with does this decrease this. We just need to get comfortable with it. So like clean needles. It's a no-brainer for me. I've seen enough people with endocarditis, HIV, and hepatitis C secondary to injecting. Like I said, my cousin died of HIV from injecting. If he had just had a clean needle. It may not have stopped him from dying, but it would have stopped the transmission of HIV, because what I think about it and I'll never know the answer to is how many people got HIV from him. And I don't know. We talk about naloxone. That to me a no-brainer. No-brainer. Everybody should have like holsters. I mean, my kids carry naloxone in their school backpacks. They're 7 and 9, and they can administer naloxone, and they know the signs and symptoms to look at. Now, granted, I'm a hyper nerd, so they're just going to do that. But at the same time, I mean, I've administered naloxone in an airport. I mean, this is just a reality of what this crisis is. And so the more that we can have it out there, the more likely it is to be used. And my kids know how to use it. If something comes up and somebody's down, even if it's from a heart attack, just go get some naloxone. And then my little, 40-pound kid's going to do CPR, and it's not going to do anything for the adult, but he's going to get some Narcan and some CPR. These are just basic things that we do on a regular basis. And so those are easy. The harder ones, supervised injection sites. These are harder for people to think about. And I have to say, even I struggled with this conversation a little bit, but then the data is pretty clear for that one, that at least in the Vancouver model and the places that they've done, they've actually increased people's entrance into treatment by 30%. So having a place where they can go means you're now consolidating where they are, which people push back on initially, but in the end that turns out to be a good thing, because then you can consolidate your efforts around it, and then you have a higher chance of that motivational interviewing and trauma-informed approach getting them into treatment. I mean, in jails, people who were injectors prior to coming into jail should leave with clean needles. They should leave with Narcan. It makes logical, math sense. It's not even a matter of an emotional judgment. If you just look at math, if they're going to go out and possibly overdose, and we want to decrease death. If I give them clean needles and naloxone, that means that if they overdose, they're probably not going to die, because somebody will know how to use naloxone. Most people currently using know how to use naloxone. They know what it is. It scares the crap out of them if they're not overdosing, because they really don't want it in their system because it hurts and it makes them basically turn on fire. But they know what it is, and they'll save people. We saw this in Camden when I had to revive a dude under a bridge with 13 milligrams of naloxone because he had a carfentanil overdose. We didn't know that at the time. but we gave him everything on the rig, and he came about. But the first 2 doses were given by 2 other homeless people who had naloxone with them, and otherwise it would have just not happened. And this comes back down to kind of the stigma piece that's been talked about, a lot. The end product is easy, right? Medication for an identifiable disease in which medication decreases the risk of death and improves the chances of stability. Right? That's all it is. At the end, the stigma that we hold for the disease, and maybe the misunderstanding of what the disease is a little bit, keeps us from just instituting that no differently than a blood pressure medication for hypertension so they don't have a stroke. And so as we do it as a community, I think those are the big things. When we look at law enforcement, the big takeaways for that is I want to make sure that people recognize it's complex, it's difficult. It's doable, but it's difficult. And it's going to require a lot of brains in that room to get it done. And you have all the brains you need here. You don't have to, the people that I've met here and talked here, you have everybody you need here. Honestly, you don't have to, pull in some massive, expertise, a little help here and there for people who've already done it in a few places. Great, but you've already done that. You have the Edie Bridge group, so Andrew Herring's, group out of Oakland is doing a great job with that. And then you have, the jail initiative where we're going to be able to do that. Those are working. But otherwise, you have a really collaborative, functional community. It has points of people who create anger and frustration, and that's life, man. That's every community on the planet. But I've sat in a lot of these rooms where half of my day is being honestly just yelled at, and that's cool. That's how it rolls sometimes. But there's frustration and there's anger and there's a lot of trust issues that go a long way. So figuring out how we identify why 13% of the population is American Indian, but 50% of the population in jails is American Indian, and how we can figure out how we can move upstream on that so that we can decrease that reality of your county. How we identify your local experts to lean in and allow them to help, and you've seen a lot of them on stage here today. So those are the big ones. And so you've already gotten the big Herculean effort, which is you already taught, right? There's already a collaborative spirit, and I think at this point it's a matter of execution on a piece of those and some standard operating procedures, some standard phone calls of who needs to be called, some ownership and attribution of who needs to be doing screening, assessment, level of care. Because just asking somebody if they, in the last 3 months, if you used injectable drugs, if their answer is yes, you're not going to. You have to assess whether or not that was because they were told they were going to do it and they were going to die if they didn't do it. Because I've had people who injected and 2 times they did it was because they were in a dealing situation, and they basically said, if you don't try your own stuff, I'm going to. And otherwise, that may be the only thing. That doesn't mean they have an opioid use disorder. So we have to go next and look at that assessment and dig in. And then level of care determination through the ASAM criteria. Those are just kind of the standard things that have to get done. No differently than if I assess a heart attack, right? Troponin, EKG, history. I look at those things, it tells me where they gotta go. And so we have to figure out how to expand what we're doing really well in a number of places here, and moving that into law enforcement at every place, so that probation doesn't feel like they're hung out. Because to feel alone and not have the capacity to treat patients, to see this and watch them die, watch them fail, watch them go bad, that is going to burn out the people you now have a good connection with. And it won't last long, because they'll get crispy, just like your child protective services workers who need good backup and help and knowledge. These are high stress realities. So what other pieces? What do you see as barriers to this? Like, what in the world could be a barrier to treating somebody for an identifiable illness that we have a treatment that's 80% effective for? Yeah, housing. This has come up in every county. This is not unique to here. It's worse in California. Poor things, you have such good weather that people would like to come here and at a disproportionate rate. We don't have as much in Michigan because it gets wicked cold in Michigan. It was literally minus 18 4 days straight. I'm not happy there. But at least in the winter. But as we look at this, housing becomes important, because what we have is a a legacy of sober living homes that have opened their arms. The vast majority of people who run these facilities are in recovery themselves, and they've done things for almost $0. It's pennies on the dollar. They just get by. They're one check away from not being able to pay the bills. This is the majority of places that I've seen, hundreds of them around the country, and now we're pushing against the entire ideological approach to their treatment of addiction. And usually it's the ideological approach that got them well. And so this was hard for me because it seemed so easy for me from a technical standpoint to just say, well, what do you care? Just take them. I mean, why are you making this a deal? They have a medication, they're stable, they just need housing. But that was me not really fully understanding what it means to make somebody do something they didn't really envision ever having to do. And it going past how they envision addiction and how stable they are in their recovery, how stable other people in that house are in recovery. So I think it's not everybody should take MAT. I think it's identifying enough housing so that those that have medication-assisted treatment have a place to go, and that those that want to be in a place where where they don't need medication-assisted treatment, that we don't have to necessarily force somebody to do something they don't want to do. And we can do that through payment. I mean, that's always the modality that moves the needle a little bit, is getting them certified and then paying them through the ODS, but you can actually pay for this through ODS now. So once they're out on probation or parole or 8109, they're Medicaid eligible. And so at that point, they're Medicaid eligible the minute that they walk out and step on the ground. So don't let there be any question about that. The legal pathway for that is the minute that they walk out, they're now, so working on getting them covered so it's activated when they walk out, you can actually cover housing with a portion of this. Some of this is also recovering derelict housing and turning that into to housing. And if you pay for people to do work, they have a tendency to do work pretty happily. This is a field where, like I say, it's full of martyrs at this point. And it's almost a badge of honor to say, I make $4 to do $10 worth of work on a regular basis. I think we have to stop doing that as a field. I think it's really important for us to say this is a medical specialty that needs the treatment capacity and capability of anything else. We should just pay for it. And so housing, we house somebody who's getting chemo. We'll put them up in houses and apartments next to hospitals. We do that on a regular basis. They may stay there for months. Ronald McDonald houses, things like this. We even house their families. We do this. We do this for other diseases. So it's not like it's not done for other things. We just need to extend it out because it's not just housing for the one person, but let's say you have a mother in recovery and she needs housing, but she's got 2 kids. We need to have family-based housing. We need to figure out how we set that up. And some of that can be group home-based, but you have to be understanding of safety around that, because if you have females who are pregnant and in recovery, many times at least one of them is going to have a violent partner. And so figuring out how you do that and make it safe. So again, it's like so close to being easy, but there's like all these little pieces that we have to look at. But I think if you pay people who have recovery housing a little more to see patients with MAT, then they'll do it. I think that for the financial safety, they'll figure it out. And to be completely honest, there are already 2 lawsuits saying it's probably not constitutional to not allow them in because they are on these medications. And that's been prosecuted through the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so with that, it's not lawful to disallow someone to get evidence-based treatment purely because you don't like a certain medication. If you have a house and they're on any other medication, anything, if you allow blood pressure medications or insulin or any of those things, which they almost all do, then it's actually, based on this case law, this common law, unlawful. Now, none of those cases have happened in California, but the minute one comes up, there's already case precedent in 2 other states, so it'll happen pretty quickly. And they're probably going to pass an extension within the ADA. That's one of the things on the table right now in the House and the Senate, to kind of extend this out, specifically to name people with addiction, in that not allowing access to evidence-based care is that. So they can do it, but there's going to be a point at which they're not going to get paid, and it's going to be deemed unlawful. So we just need to figure out how to make it happen, but be cognizant that it's not easy to tell somebody what to do. It's America, man. Nobody likes to be told what to do. And if you don't want to do something, you don't like somebody to tell you have to do it. But if you're going to be a part of the medical treatment family, we get told what to do all the time. I mean, who here works in a hospital? The oversight inside of a hospital, holy cow. I mean, if I miss an aspirin on a chest pain patient, I got 3 people that call me the next day. I have to write a little thing about why I didn't give an aspirin. And it's an aspirin. I did everything right. Daddy goes home with a stent, all better. I still get 3 calls and a follow-up because quality is important. And so we're getting to that point in addiction where we're going to have to be looking over each other's shoulders. And housing is going to be no different because we also have to make sure, what do we do with ones that are not eligible for housing? What do we do with people that are on that are arsonists? What do we do with somebody who is on sex offenders registry? These are people not eligible for housing, the vast majority, nowhere. And so we have to be kind of inclusive of things that may not make us feel great all the time. But we have to be thoughtful that we can't be choosy. We just have to say, how do we build a system that's inclusive and how do we make it work? And so these are little pieces. But housing, huge issue. There's a question there?
Yeah, so just the complexity of the housing issue in county, in our areas, there's just not housing available.
Yeah.
So it's not like you can pay someone more money to get the housing. People just can't find housing. Middle class folks coming in who have jobs who are not suffering from any kind of substance disorder can't find housing. So that's a whole other topic. But I agree, housing is an issue we need to figure out. The other part is that I really appreciate you kind of saying over and over community, because it's really the community who's going to address some of this stuff, and especially with probation. Historically, probation was, and still is, an entity organization that takes the order from the court and then makes sure it's enforced.
Right.
There's really no gray area. Violating terms and conditions, and probation is expected to enforce that, however that may be. Now, we're getting better and better at it, but I also see that the community's not catching up to what we're trying to do and train about addiction or incremental behaviors and how to treat that in cognitive behavioral therapy. They broke the law. I don't care how they broke it, and probation's job is to make sure that they follow those terms and conditions to the T. And if they don't, then we're, as probation, looked at as we're not doing our job. The other part of that is that as probation evolves and probation officers become more educated about the different brain functions and what have you, we are starting to incorporate some of that stuff, and it's hard as a probation officer to go, I know you got to follow that term and condition of probation, but I also know that using is a disease, and we need to figure out better ways to deal with that. And if I don't lock you up, am I going to find you dead the next day? I don't want that on my conscience. So I know that you're using, I'm going to go ahead and lock you up so that at least I know that I did my part in keeping you alive.
Yeah, no. And so this is the dilemma, right? So let's say that the jail had game on treatment. That they had good screening, good assessment, they would start you on MAT. Then that would be helpful for some. For flash incarceration for stabilization, because stabilization would take place on the flash incarceration side, and then they would leave, reestablish on MAT with a new plan. The problem is we're not there yet. So now what it is just sitting in another place, possibly going through withdrawal again. And then creating a situation where they're even, I don't know if you're actually decreasing the risk of overdose is the question that I haven't been able to answer, because I've tried to figure this out, because the overdose rates inside of jails are higher than the overdose rates in the general population when you look at a per capita basis. So I don't actually know, and it's jail dependent, right? Some have a better version, a better control over that than others. But if you take the aggregate, the overdose rate's pretty equivalent inside and outside of jail. And so I don't know if we're actually, by doing that, decreasing their chances of overdose, especially if they're going into active withdrawal and we're not treating it. I think the biggest piece is figuring out how we do a better job of educating the general public about what the role of probation is. You know, the difference between criminogenic behavior and addiction or psychiatric related illness. Because if you have a perseverative thought disorder that makes you paranoid all the time and you're worried about these things, you're more likely to have pretty predictive but destructive behavior if that's not treated properly. So if they're not on the right medication or in the right therapy, they're still going to be, not, acting in a way that is safe within the community, and so you're going to be stuck in the same position where they're not safe for themselves in the community, so I put them back. The problem with jails is now, especially in California, they've taken on the role of prison, and then since the 1970s, they've taken on the role of inpatient psych ward, and then also handled the role of severe unstable addiction. So that seems to be what jail has turned into, is basically the housing unit for all of those ailments. And then, oh, by the way, there are some people who just have criminogenic behavior. So I think what we have to figure out is not just a solution for what we do for opioids, because that's actually pretty easy. Stabilize them on meds, get them into therapy, get the right level of care, help make sure that they have some stable housing. For housing, you might want to look at what Detroit did. They actually did this small house thing where they built 30 micro houses, like those little, everybody watches like mini house thing or whatever that show is on Discovery. Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. And they build it, but it's got everything that they need. And then what they do, because the vast majority of people are getting some cash benefit from either the state or retirement or VA or something like that, and they apply that toward it, and then they actually end up owning it. And it's a micro plot in a small house, but it's the first time when you talk to these people in recovery, it's the first time they've ever said, I've had my own space to change my shirt. When I don't have somebody here, just to sit here and listen to music for a second, my own music, nobody bugging me. And then at the end of it, they actually own a house. It's a small house on a small plot, but you can do these in areas that are pretty interesting. So there are ways, I think, that could be some community investment that may be interesting on the housing side. And actually, most of those are paid for by a small millage coupled with health insurance papers. Blue Cross actually covered a portion of it, and then a small temporary millage. So there are just like interesting things you can do in the community. But it sounds like we need to dig in on the adjudication side and help them with a set of rules that are easier to put down so that it gives you the appropriate leeway, so that you know that if you have somebody who's unstable, your first thought is the emergency department for stabilization on medication and evaluation for placement as compared to jail. Because that's what we want to do, is if you have someone who's unstable and at risk for death, I want their default is treatment, not confinement. And I think we all want that, but it's just trying to figure out how we make that happen. And because confinement, I don't know if it comes out in decreasing risk based on what at least the aggregate numbers are. I don't know your specific jail numbers, but in general. And but the concept is, basic form of treatment for addiction is this. You identify that they have a disease, you treat it, and then you monitor it. That's kind of it. And we haven't gotten those three things put together in such a way that we can use evidence-based tools to identify it. We have emotional baggage and a lot of stuff in the way of just doing evidence-based treatment. Tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit more. I'm going to dig in more to MAT and outcomes and stuff like that. But when we talk about opioids again, over 1,000 studies on methadone, well-done studies. And it averages out around 70% of people are stable at 1 year and still retaining treatment. For buprenorphine, we have over a few hundred studies at this point, and it shows that people started on buprenorphine for opioid use disorder have about a 60% stabilization rate and retention and treatment in 1 year. Naltrexone, it's only been around for legal for 9 years, so we have tens. We have, I guess 18 publications that are of standard high enough to really use. And for those, because there's so few studies, we still don't know the exact populations that it's best for. But retention and treatment in those studies were pretty varied, and it was anywhere from 27% to 70%. And 70% was a Russian study, and I'm not sure if that transports to INEO. So I think there are possibly some differences, but but as we look at those, that's better than if we do nothing. The average natural rate of resolution of an addiction is about 5%. So 5% of people will do the cold turkey. I'm not going to use it anymore, right? They're over here. They're making dopamine. They suck it up, and they're just obstinate enough to not do it, and they do that. And then there's this group that can do self-help, and depending on the community and the way applied, gives you that anywhere from 8 to kind of 14 to 15%, depending on what it is. And this is opioids, right? It tends more toward 8 because most are not really inclusive with people who are really, it can be very stigmatizing. I mean, how bad does it make you feel if you have a slip on a weekend and they take your coin away? It's just like mean. So that, but for opioids, that's it. Intensive behavioral therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, wraparound services, and case management, where we've done all of that, is about 18% effective. I mean, you look at all of those things, and you look at 18 to 60, 18 to 70% effective rates. I mean, to me, the evidence is pretty clear as we start to look at it. And again, those outcomes have been validated in multiple groups of people, including American Indian populations, which have a significant early traumatic genetic predisposition for addiction anyway, and the first one very much was alcohol. But while alcohol is no longer the primary substance of choice that we talk about, it's still the number one. It's still there. It's not as pervasive as it was, but it's still there. And how many people are getting medication-assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder? We don't even talk about that one, but there's medication that decreases use by up to 60% per month. Anybody know that? Which medication is that? Yeah, the fact that you all are going, well, obviously it's that. It's Vivitrol, naltrexone. And in fact, naltrexone was first FDA approved for alcohol use disorder. And for a subset of the population, it's like a light switch. It just turns it off. This is one of the best medications I've ever used in my homeless, recalcitrant alcohol use population. In fact, I had one of my most common ER customers who became a patient of mine in my outpatient clinic when I opened that, who got angry at me. He's like, "I'm so pissed at you, doc." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "I don't even want alcohol anymore. I hate you." He was like really angry at me that he didn't have that. So I think as we look at this, we really have to be introspective about building a larger system that is not just culturally competent, but actually culturally developed for this locale, and that it includes the trauma-informed care, destigmatization, and all the evidence-based treatments, and most importantly, the entire community has the back of the person who is unstable at this time and has addiction, and treats them with respect. And I would say, if somebody doesn't want help, the one thing I'll leave you with is what I tell all my patients in the ER who I try to help but don't want it, is I tell them very specifically, I got your back. Somebody cares about you. Come back if you need help. And just saying that, if everybody just said that, that would make a huge difference. So I'll leave you with that today, and then we have a lot more to talk about tomorrow.